This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome in, everybody. On today's lecture, we are going to be talking about gaining access as far as vehicle extrication, and then also we're going to be adding in components as far as highway safety and road safety as well. This is going to tie into our EMS operations lecture that we did yesterday. This is going to be chapter 43 in our textbook. I actually developed this PowerPoint based on a different EMT textbook that dives a little bit deeper into vehicle extrication and then also highway safety. So with highway emergency operations, always limit the amount of resources that you actually need, but don't stress your capabilities out based on this. Now, the rationale behind this is keeping people out of danger at this point, because the more people that you put on scene, the higher chance that somebody could get struck by another vehicle, what have you. But remember that we need enough resources on hand in order to actually treat that patient. When we are arriving on scene, use your resources on hand. So if I'm the first arriving one on scene and I'm an ambulance, I'm not going to block that scene necessarily because I only have limited protection capabilities with that ambulance. What I would rather use is using a large fire engine, something with a little bit of weight to it to go ahead and block that area. So if I'm on a fire department or rescue department, that's where I'm going to utilize that. If I'm the first arriving on scene, I'm going to go ahead and block that protected area. Now, this bullet point, open traffic lanes as quickly and safely as possible. This allows for easier flow with traffic. Now, this isn't one of my objectives. Yes, it's great if I can allow traffic to get by, but this is going to be more geared towards law enforcement. I'm more concerned about the safety of my crew, more concerned about the safety of that patient. And as far as everybody else is concerned, if they have to wait in their car an extra 15 minutes, then that is a small price to pay. When we do arrive on scene for something like this, we are the first arriving engine company or the first arriving ambulance. We have additional units coming in the scene. We want to give a brief scene size up and voice that over the radio so that other responding units know what to expect when they're arriving on scene. Because most of the time when we're dealing with something like this that's pictured, we're going to have multiple fire engines or rescue squad members, and then also multiple ambulance services. So if I can radio in to the other responding units, we have a 2-vehicle accident on the left side of the highway, 2 vehicles involved, moderate damage, something along those lines. That's going to give the approaching units a better capability. Now we can also see in this picture a great demonstration of utilizing our resources. So difficult to tell, but we have a fire engine blocking that roadway leading up to the accident. We have a second engine blocking the upper portion of that incident. And then we have an ambulance that's actually located in front of that top fire engine. So that makes it easier and safer to actually load that patient up, even with that traffic approaching. Another example of this, and again, strategically place your engines or your ambulances, what have you, so that you're limiting the amount of exposure for your personnel who are also getting out of that engine or that ambulance. So this is a great example. So they are positioned towards the curb. And as a result of that, it gives that captain and that firefighter in the back getting out a little bit more scene protection compared to if they were positioned the other way. So our initial response, if we are the first arriving engine company or ambulance service, we're also going to establish command. And again, within our radio report that we're going to give to those oncoming units, confirm that exact location of where that incident is. Oftentimes, we're going to get relatively generic information of where exactly that incident is, because I am at fault at this too, is I don't really pay attention to the highway mile markers. But once you do identify that, make sure that you radio in that information. We talked about blocking upstream, and we also talked about blocking it downstream as well. Again, try and use the biggest trucks, the most weight as best you can when you are on scene too. Make sure that you're still utilizing your lights. We're going to talk about night operations in a couple of slides, but during the day, always keep your lights on. So this is what I talked about earlier too, as far as positioning that rig. So this is our upstream rig, and we can see that it's positioned towards the open traffic lanes. So if this captain and this firefighter is getting out of this fire engine, then they are exposed to all of that incoming traffic. Now, people as a whole are not very good drivers, especially if you put some visual stimuli out there like this for them. They get that chicken neck syndrome where they're just staring at the scene trying to figure out what's going on. And a lot of first responders, police officers, and fire department members have lost their lives due to highway accidents such as this. So scene safety considerations, again, using those defense mechanisms. Exiting that vehicle safely, we always should have a vest on when we are exiting that vehicle, and do a good 5-second window check to make sure that there's no approaching vehicles. Don our PPE, so if it's in our SOGs and our SOPs, then we should be in full turnout gear. Make sure that you have your full turnout gear on, helmet, vest, gloves, eye protection. And then again, use law enforcement as that buffer zone as well. So especially, if we're looking at the city of Duluth and something is located on the hill leading up into Proctor on the highway, make sure that you have law enforcement strategically placed lower down that hill so they're given that information to oncoming traffic so they start slowing prior to the crest of that hill. Because if we're speeding up that hill, it doesn't take a lot of time before all of a sudden this traffic is already upon us. Do your best diligence too, as far as using 3 points of contact when you are getting out of any type of emergency apparatus too. A lot of slips, falls, sprains, strains can happen even in a small height such as this when he's getting out of that paramedic response unit. Here, great example too of utilizing law enforcement, and what they're actually creating here is basically a patient loading zone. So they have law enforcement vehicles that are basically surrounding that ambulance so that once we do get that patient loaded up, we have that great buffer zone that we can get that patient safely located in the ambulance. Because this is where we're really most exposed, is when we have that patient, we're bringing them to the reverse side of that ambulance, and that's where we actually have to get that patient loaded up. So there is a fancy formula as far as positioning cones and or flares. Generally, the more cones, the better. And try and place them out as far out as you can with those capabilities in order to alarm any upcoming traffic. But again, as far as concerns over this formula, I really couldn't care less of actually breaking down the formula. I just want to give enough leeway to my rescue providers and then also that oncoming traffic so that they know that there's an incident that's occurring upstream. So we can see here, this is a horrible example of alarming people of a scene approaching. So here we only got about 12 feet of leeway. Now, I want to position those cones much farther out so that people do understand. For whatever reason, people absolutely hate hitting cones. So again, the more cones, the better in that circumstance. When we're dealing with light operations, this is where we're going to actually toggle our changes within our lights to better ensure the safety of that oncoming traffic, because certain warning lights will actually basically blind that oncoming traffic. So our red and amber warning lights should be on, but our headlights should be off because those headlights really blind that approaching traffic. as well as our fog lights. Our traffic directional boards, they should be on and operating. But we can see too, and we talked about stimuli earlier. I mean, this is a very visual overstimulating circumstance. We got road flares, we got our warning devices on, we got headlights, we got fog lights, and A, it's very unsafe for approaching traffic, but B, trying to do a proper patient assessment when all these things are going on, it can make it very difficult for us to do that assessment, and then also even focus on our patient as well. For our vehicle extrication, now we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when we actually had the cars out, and all, or I shouldn't say all, but most of you guys do have experience within vehicle extrication, but these are just some basic tips when we are performing that extrication. So first, gather a plan and prepare for that rescue. So again, we're going to be breaking this down into, is this an emergent move? Is this an urgent move? Do we need to take C-spine precautions? And how are we going to actually get that patient out from their vehicle onto the stretcher and then into the ambulance? I always want to recognize and manage any type of hazards. These scenes can become very unsafe because A, we got traffic, B, we got jagged pieces of metal, broken glass, and then we also have leaking fluid. So it can become a hazardous material scene as well, especially depending on if there is a semi-truck involved that might be carrying that hazardous material substance. Before we actually enter that vehicle, make sure that we stabilize it to the best of our abilities, wheel chocks. Now, if we're operating on an ambulance and we're waiting for a rescue squad or a fire department to get there, we most likely are going to have a limited amount of equipment and capabilities. So one easy trick that you can do is go ahead and let the airs out of the tires, and that's going to stabilize that vehicle if it is still sitting on the tires. Next, gaining access to that patient. So this is usually where it falls to the smallest person, depending on whether you can actually get in with doors or broken windows. But getting access to that patient, maintaining C-spine, and then doing your primary assessment of diving into, is there any major life threats? Is there complications to the airway, breathing, or circulation at all? Next, we might have to disentangle the patient. So if they still have their seatbelt on and it's compromised, we might have to go ahead and cut that seatbelt or simply eject that from the seatbelt holder. If it is a complex scenario where that car is crushed, it might be a little bit more intuitive than simply just releasing the seatbelt. Then we're going to choose our equipment as far as immobilizing that patient. Do we have time, or do we have to use that KED board, or are we going to do a more urgent move where we're going to do a C-spine precautions with a C-collar and simply guide them out of the vehicle? Or is this going to be an emergency move where we're just removing that patient? So an example of this would be if that car is on fire or if it's unstable and it's on a slope. After we've provided that assessment, that care, and transported them either to the ambulance or if we're the ambulance ourselves, then we can go ahead and start to tear down and terminate that rescue scenario. Upon terminating that rescue scenario, this is where we're going to follow our SOGs and our SOPs. So some law enforcement individuals will want us to stay on scene until that vehicle is actually loaded up onto a tow truck, and then we can wipe up any debris. Other agencies will allow us to clear as soon as that vehicle has the patient out of it. All right, so that's our down and dirty version of gaining access to that patient. We'll dive a little bit deeper into it once we do our skills sessions on Thursday. But that wraps up chapter 43, which is gaining access. All right, thanks everybody.